Hello and welcome, intermediate students, to another intermediate lesson at learnpianolive.com. This is an intermediate lesson, so the assumption is that you can probably play a couple songs at least well enough to impress a couple friends. You might have some basic understanding of music theory or something, but you really haven't had any formal training. So if that's you, you're in the right place. If you feel, throughout this lesson like it's way too advanced, you might want to go back and check out yesterday's lesson. It's in the archives, the beginner's version of this lesson. That might answer a lot of your questions, but feel free to ask away, ask any questions. This is about you and me, so you got to ask questions so I know, how to help you best. And there's a couple other things I want to talk to you too about before this countdown clock hits 0. All right, first and most important, ask a lot of questions. The way that you're going to do that is there's a couple different ways. You can jump in the chat room and talk with the other students who are logged in at the same time. I'll be watching the chat room too. You ask your questions there, or if it's a question that's just for me, a question about the lesson, especially if you know it's one that's going to fit best at the question and answer time at the end, then you can just put your name and your question in the box below this video, click submit, and then I will get that. Now, if you're already in the archives, if you're watching this not live, but you're watching this in the archives, then make sure at the end of the lesson you click on the survey button. You don't have to fill out the entire survey. If you want to, I'd love your feedback, but really the best part of that is that you can put your question in there, and then when you click submit, then I will get all of your questions. I'll make sure that you get them answered, whether you're in the archives or you're live. Right next to this video, there should be a PDF button and an MP3 button. Now, you don't really need those till after the lesson because I'm going to be showing you on screen the PDF and showing you how to use it. And I'll play the MP3 during the lesson too, so you know at the end of the lesson how you're going to use that. Some people, though, like to print out the PDF ahead of time, so as I'm making notes on my version, they can make the same notes on their version, but it works either way. All right, this is perhaps the most important part. You need to leave the lesson when you feel like you're sufficiently challenged. So, I'm teaching these lessons, 12 to 15 lessons a month. Normally, in traditional lessons, you're getting like a lesson every other week or so. So this is just way too much for you to take in. So, the goal is for you to get some little nugget of something that you can really practice on, really work on. Once you feel like you have that, then you really don't need anything else from me. Go practice. That's where this stuff is really going to happen. You're not going to get through this lesson and be able to play something really well. You're going to get through this lesson and have the information that you need to practice more effectively. That's really the goal here. So don't feel bad about taking off early. If you feel like halfway through the lesson you got as much as you can take in at that time, then go practice that thing, and then come back whenever you've got that thing down, or you're bored with it, or you just want to check out the next topic. Don't forget also that you've got the archives too. So if you want to see one little thing, just repeat it over and over and over. Just give me, hopefully within 24 hours after the lesson, this thing will be up in the archives, so you can just go back and watch it over and over and over and over and just get that little segment down. All right, this lesson specifically today, out of the 8 sectors of musicianship, is one that's focused on inspiration. So this is not one that you're going to necessarily leave with a really specific goal of here's the little nugget that you're supposed to practice. But hopefully you leave the lesson today feeling more energized, more encouraged to go out there and practice, because that's really where all of the magic happens, is in your own personal practice time. So the goal of today is to get you inspired to go out there and practice. So let's go.
How's it going?
So this is Joe Gilman. This is Dr. Joe Gilman. He's a teacher at ARC Sac State Brubeck Institute. He played in Capital Jazz Project. Was the director of that for a long time. Been doing the Stanford Jazz Workshop for forever, and I am so privileged to have him. So thank you, Dr. Gilman, for joining me today. So yeah, you want to go ahead and just play us a little something here to start us off?
Yes, I'm already playing. Sure, I can keep playing though.
All right.
Yeah, I'll just kind of keep going. I'm just sort of playing an F blues here. I don't know.
Cool.
Is that cool? Or,
That's awesome.
Yeah. See, let's just start over again. That's just a little something there, huh?
That's all right. Yeah. So then we're gonna just. I'm gonna fire away some questions from the students. And students, if I don't get to your question exactly, it's because I try to combine it with some other questions to be respectful of Dr. Gilman's time here. So hopefully, I got kind of the essence of everybody's question in here. But first of all, Dr. Gilman, could you talk about the importance or the role of humility as a musician? Like, there's a lot of talking bad about drummers or guitarists, or jazz is better than classical, or classical is better than, or pop music, and how it's so terrible. And do you have any comments on that, and how you've seen that people that you admire maybe that way, or not admire?
Yeah, sure. I guess I would say that years ago, there might have been a lot more of a separation between the different genres of music, or the different genres of musicians, and how they perceived each other. The classical musicians kind of kept to themselves, the jazzers kind of kept to themselves, the rock musicians were over here. There might have been somewhat of a mutual respect for each other in the different genres,
Right.
but there definitely were these different, pockets. And you could say that some of the classical musicians felt that they were the only really serious ones, and the jazzers were really thinking, well, the classical music is a little bit dated, and we're doing something new all the time. And the rockers, who knew exactly what the rockers were thinking? Hey, they're just out having a good time or whatever. But I think as time has evolved, I've found that more and more musicians of all these different genres really, truly respect what everyone else is doing. I've met a lot of high-level classical musicians. When you tell them you're a jazz musician, they're really interested. It's an important part of American music. It's had a big contribution to our musical landscape. They're really interested in it, and they know that jazz musicians have to be very serious and studious, and have a wide knowledge of a lot of different kinds of music. Jazz musicians, I think, respect classical music. I mean, it's a brilliant combination of classical music and our own, musical tradition. Rockers, I know, or R&B musicians, use a lot of jazz language. I mean, having the ability to have a technical, command of the instrument, which would come from practicing classical music, or a lot of that genre. So and there's a lot of cross styles that are happening too. Lots of jazz music borrows a lot from classical music and from R&B. You hear a lot of R&B borrowing from all this stuff. So more and more, I think, generally a musician is expected to know more and more about all these different genres, and have some ability and be conversant in all these different genres.
Right.
So
is there a genre that's best to start with? Maybe is it better to start with learning classical if you're wanting to become a jazz pianist, or where do you count the basics?
It's hard to say, but I'd say certainly the place to start would be where you'd be the music that you like. I mean, if someone's starting out, it's always best to start out with something that interests you, rather than, well, I'm really interested in doing this, but someone says I have to do this for the first 10 years.
Right.
A lot of times a student might just lose interest in it and not want to do it at all. That being said, as far as the keyboard goes, or the piano goes, there's all kinds of great methods, such as your own, that start you, with something very basic, introducing you to the keys on the instrument, some basic technique and finger positions and things like that, and learning a few basic songs. But most real accomplished pianists that I know in any genre at one point or another went through, steady learning of the keyboard and some basic pieces, and learning how to read a little bit, and learning a little bit about a harmony on the way. I have met a few very great musicians who are entirely self-taught, and just figured it out all on their own. And I've met a few the jazz pianists that started with jazz, and they never really did any of the other stuff. Even as early as 7 or 8 years old, they were just starting to learn how to play jazz. So,
Right.
But certainly getting some basics together with technique, learning a little bit about harmony and things like that along the way, as much as you can tolerate, I think is a really good way to go, to be well-rounded.
Okay. Yeah. When you practice these days, what do you play? What does a guy in your world do on the piano to get better?
Well, personally, I need to do what I can to keep my technique in check. If I don't have a lot of time to practice, the one thing that definitely does need to, in all instances, need to be kept together is my ability to play the instrument. So if I've only got a little bit of time to practice, probably what I'm going to do is spend some time just keeping my technique together, which would be things like scales and some arpeggios, technical exercises, things like that. So I need to keep that together first. Beyond that, if I've got some extra time, a lot of times my practicing can be very project-oriented, meaning maybe I've got a gig coming up in a week or 2 weeks or a month or whatever, and I know there's a particular repertoire I've got to have together for that. So I might spend some time working specifically on that repertoire for that particular gig and working out the kinks. You know, I'm what's called a collaborative musician. I play mostly in groups. I play some solo piano, but mostly what I do is play in group settings, and I'm mostly a jazz player. So I'll look through the music that I'm playing, and I'll sort of work out the kinks, find some areas that I might be less familiar with, and work out some things. You know, so that, in addition to that, though, I continue to keep my ears and eyes, but mostly my ears open for new kinds of sounds, new artists that are coming down, and what's going on in the development of this music these days. I read about you know, things in the development of the music, both in the history and what's going on now.
Right.
I'm open to all kinds of different kinds of music. I happen to really enjoy, it might be kind of weird, but sort of, you know, avant-garde 20th century classical music, which sounds like a bunch of, you know, clangs and bangs to most people.
Can you give us some names?
Yeah,
composers?
sure. So Karl-Heinz Stockhausen and Pierre Boulez and some minimalist composers such as Steve Reich and Philip Glass and Terry Riley and John Adams and you know, all this kind of stuff, even some 12-tone composers, you know, which is going back a little bit, but, you know, people like Schoenberg and Alban Berg and stuff like that. You know, I mean, it's not the kind of thing generally that, you know, you would put on when you got a house party are going on and people are coming over and you want to have some enjoyable music. But it's stuff that the sounds that are created there are really interesting to me. And I don't immediately know when I'm listening to this what I would do with it. But I know that it's different, and I know that it kind of gives my ears a taste of little different sounds than they're used to. And so it kind of puts a little flavor in there that I'm trying to decide, you know, how might I use, you know, some of this as just a little spice to something else that I might be, you know, doing otherwise. So,
Right.
and I'm just interested in learning about the history of the music in general. So things that have happened that have been influential or important, I like to know about those things, and I like to investigate them a little bit.
Right. Do you feel like you'd have to get to a certain point in your playing ability or your listening ability or something in order to be able to more appreciate that? Why does it sound weird to some people and interesting to others?
Well, some of the music that I mentioned, let's just take a couple of it. The first couple of composers I mentioned, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen and Pierre Boulez. I mean, this is very dissonant music that to most people would sound very disjunct and unorganized to most people that are used to popular music, which gives you pretty much everything you need, you know, in 3 minutes, and has nice catchy melodies and repetitive rhythms and danceable rhythms and, you know, things like that. So you don't get, let me try this one last time. You don't get that with this music. It's much more based on texture, you know, musical color, and the process by which the piece was composed is more important than the way the piece actually sounds itself, which might sound a little odd. You know, wait a minute, you know, what do you mean it doesn't have to sound good to be good? I mean, well, yeah, some of these composers were interested in what method did you use to compose the piece. Did you use some kind of interesting, you know, combination of notes, or, you know, an arrangement of notes, or a combination of instruments, or that kind of thing? Was there, you know, or is it based on an interpretation of a painting or a poem, or, you know, a mathematical property or something like that? And that's what's interesting. And the actual sound of it, you're like, oh, well, that's what that sounds like when you take E equals MC squared and you make a piece of music out of it, you know? That's what's interesting about it.
So, but there has to be like some, I mean, you're translating some, you know, beginning point into a piece of music. Do you, what basis of music do you need to start with? Like, are these people who have played a lot of pop music and jazz and classical, and then they take the next level, or is this like an entirely other route to sound creation?
Good point. I mean, it's hard to say. You know, it's different for everybody. I think there are some musicians that, you know, are first interested in popular music, and then they start investigating some other things, and then they just happen to like that path a little better or as much, and they start investigating that, and the next thing you know, they've gone down that path of contemporary classical music or avant-garde music or sound design or whatever it is, and they follow that path. Let's see, a couple of examples would be, there's the Beatles record, which is called Sgt. Pepper's.
Yeah.
And this has got this collage of all these, somewhat famous and some cult figure type of people on the artwork. Well, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, one of the musicians that I mentioned, is one of the people in that collage. He's this avant-garde classical composer. And it turns out that the Beatles were very interested in this kind of sound making that was happening. This is the late 60s. So they were interested in that. Now, if you listen to one of their popular tunes, you don't hear an immediate correlation to that. But there were some of the productions on some of their songs. I want to say A Day in the Life, and there's a couple of other songs, Revolution Number 9 and things like that, that use a lot of the same very avant-garde classical techniques that some of these composers were using, the Beatles started to use. Even some of these techniques popped up in things like, what's it called, Pet Sounds, I think, which is a Beach Boys record from around the same time. I mean, these things were starting to make their way into popular culture. I also mentioned some other composers like Philip Glass and Stephen Reich. These are minimalist composers, and if you listen to some new wave music from the early 70s, or you listen to a lot of techno music, there's a great producer whose name is Brian Eno, who he's basically produced everybody. But Brian Eno was a huge minimal music fan back in the 70s and 80s. So I think I'm sort of answering the question, which is that it's just like someone might start in one genre and their interest takes them to another place. It's not that they're necessarily advancing, and this means that you're a better musician because you went this route.
Right.
It just means I'm following this because my interest is taking me there, and maybe I'm still interested in this pop or this jazz thing, but I'm going to use this other kind of music as something to enhance or flavor the kind of music that I'm interested in.
Wow.
And it's worked the opposite way too. There have been some hardcore jazz musicians or rockers. Wait, let me turn it the other way. Or classical musicians,
right,
who start out by writing this pretty eccentric and somewhat cerebral music, and after a while they say, I've had enough of this. I want to try, writing something that has a little bit more of a popular, edge to it, and so they start going that way as well. So what I have found though is that in any kind of music, I've had questions. This is way back when I was in undergraduate school, and I was a jazz major. I was a classical major too, but there was a guy who was a classical major, and he says, "Hey, do you think if I spend a lot of time this summer, I can learn how to play jazz?" And that doesn't seem like an unusual question to most people, but it actually is a very strange question, because in any genre of music, be it classical, jazz, rock, R&B, gospel music, anything, there's people out there that dedicate their entire life to this one style, or even one sub-style within that style.
Right.
So for someone to say, if I spend the next 3 months, can I learn how to play jazz? Well, I've been spending the last 30 some odd, almost, I don't know, even more than that, just trying to learn jazz, and I find there's sub areas in jazz that I still need to. I mean, the more you work at it, the more you realize you really still, there's even more to work at.
Right. What are your favorite subgenres of that?
Of jazz, just period, or that's hard to say. I really like a style called bebop, and this would be a style that came out in the 40s and the early 50s. Not a lot of household names, you might say, in a popular sense, that came out of bebop. The two most famous bebop pianists were a guy named Bud Powell and another pianist named Thelonious Monk. Mm-hmm. There was some bebop musicians on other instruments. Probably the main one is a saxophonist named Charlie Parker, a trumpet player named Dizzy Gillespie, who's right here behind me. Right here is Dizzy Gillespie. And we've got some other people behind me too. We got Miles over here. You got Miles Davis. You got John Coltrane. So anyway, I like bebop a lot. There's another interesting. Actually, there's one called post bop, which is more like Herbie Hancock. If you're familiar with him, he's still around doing a lot of great things. And that was kind of in the 60s, and it's just sort of a lot of the same rhythms, a lot of the same language, just a little bit more modern. It kind of gets into some different scales and some different rhythmic feels and things like that.
Can you play us some examples of either of those?
Bebop and
Yeah,
post-bop?
yeah. What's the difference? What do they sound like?
Yeah, so some Bud Powell bebop might sound like, and I won't play a melody here, but I'll just kind of improvise in his style.
Okay.
Bud Powell might play something like this. That's very Bud Powell-like.
Right.
And these melodies that I'm playing are actually very unpianistic, meaning that they actually come from horn players, saxophone and trumpet kind of lines, that Bud Powell took that language and moved it to the piano.
Right.
So by unpianistic, I mean some of these little nooks and crannies and crossovers and things like that are not the kinds of fingerings and melodies that you'd see in a typical kind of pianistic piece like you might get in, say, Chopin or Beethoven or something, Mozart, something like that. Thelonious Monk's sound was a lot more discordant and dissonant and used a lot more smaller and dissonant intervals. So he used a little bit of humor in there too. So so this is, Monk. He's a little bit more jagged edges, things like that. A lot of humor, really some little cross rhythms and things like that.
Yeah.
Herbie Hancock, who might play these same two tunes, would play it a little bit different. There'd be might be a little bit more, just a little bit more modern feel or something like that. Let's see. Who knows what he would do? Yeah, so I don't know. Do those sound different? They all sound the same to me. They don't sound any different.
Really?
If they sound a little bit different, I'm trying to give you some idea. But
Yeah.
different scale choices, a little bit different rhythmic feel. That's a little bit more of a modal, kind of a straight eighth jazzy kind of thing.
Right.
Actually, the progression I just played by Herbie Hancock and the progression I played just before that with Thelonious Monk were exactly the same progression. Two different keys, but kind of an entirely different feel there.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. So the Herbie Hancock stuff would be like the post bop.
Yeah, I'm calling him post bop,
yeah.
but it's kind of hard. Jazz musicians generally, if you went to a great jazz musician and said, "Hey, what style do you play in?" A lot of them don't even really want to answer that question,
Right.
Because they're kind of like, "Well, I'm just a creative musician. I just do what I do."
Right.
So don't make me say I'm a bebop player or I play hard bop or whatever kind of thing. I just go with the flow and I do what I feel and I listen to stuff I like and I just play what I play. But with the deal with Herbie Hancock is he borrowed a lot from some of the bebop players. I mean, sometimes you could hear some of those fancy lines I was playing in the Bud Powell example. You'll hear things similar to that with Herbie, but he's also kind of throwing in some different rhythmic devices and scale choices and intervals and things like that. He's sort of playing over at the top and playing around the chords a little bit more than some of the earlier players would be, who would really be digging into the chords.
Right. So has there always been as much a fragmentation of like genres and stuff? Because like right now it seems like with rock, like you can't be a rock musician. You have to be like an indie punk steam something
Yeah.
rocker. Is it kind of the same thing with jazz then back in the 50s and 60s and or when the stuff or has it become more fragmented over time?
Yeah, definitely more fragmented over time to the point where there's discussions about some things that are happening in jazz, and I'll do this little, where am I? Here? That little jazz term. Some people would argue whether it really should even be called that or not. I mean, in the very earliest days of jazz, we basically you're going back to the turn of the 20th century, and that's Louis Armstrong, some other people like Sidney Bechet, and who's a saxophonist and clarinetist, and Joe Leroy Morton, and people like that. It was pretty defined what jazz was. I mean, it had a certain rhythmic feel, and the melodies were interpreted a certain way, and they would, as we get to a little bit later styles of jazz, like swing, well, now you've got sort of the early jazz guys, and you got the swing guys who are doing a little bit more danceable kind of stuff, and they're starting to dig into the harmony a little bit more than the early jazz guys. Then it evolves. I mean, things evolve, but rarely do they evolve in a direct linear way.
Right.
It's not like, this style happened to this year, and then this style happened to this year,
Right.
and then this style. It doesn't really happen that way. You have to think of it more like a tree or like a vine or something like that, which is like it starts with the trunk. This is the roots, and this is the basis of what happened.
Right.
And then, some people took that and shot off this way a little bit, and some people took that and shot off this way. So you might get sort of the, I don't know, maybe some gospel jazz and swing or something like that kind of happening. And then some people stuck with swing, but other people moved on to this bebop thing. So about every 10 years or so, at least in the early years, you'd get sort of a new, style. We had cool
Right.
jazz, we had hard bop, and so you get more and more and more of these subgenres, happening to the point where today, you'd go, well, what's going on? I mean, geez, some jazz sounds awfully close to classical music,
Right.
and some jazz sounds awfully close to what you're saying, like some R&B or some, indie. Like you say, a lot of jazzers listen to indie rock. I mean, there's a great band out there called Bad Plus. There's others too, which in a sense sound like an acoustic version of some indie rock garage band stuff that's out there.
Right.
And so then I guess let me know if I'm taking too long to answer your
No,
question
you're
as
good,
well.
you're good.
The question would be, at what point do you stop calling it jazz? I mean, at what point does it really sound like it's not even related to this original thing from Louis Armstrong and Count Basie and Duke Ellington?
Right.
It sounds like it's evolved into a completely different thing. At what point does this branch of this tree sound as if it's really sort of becoming its own new
Right.
tree, and certain elements of jazz that seem like they were always there was, this feeling of it having an African, some kind of reference to the African American experience and lifestyle and culture and that music. And when that part of it gets stripped away, and we no longer hear some essence of that, being it the blues or
Right.
syncopation or call and response or all these things that sort of made their way through. I'm going to use some large terms here. I hope I'm not scaring
Yeah,
people
no,
away. Is
you're
everybody
good,
turned
you're
up?
good.
Anybody still out there? Who is this guy and what are these big terms he's using here? But there's this. Things were brought to the United States from an African, have an African ancestry. It's called the African diaspora, and there's these things that seem like they need to be there. So if those things that were originally there and what made the art form what it is, if they're gone, in other words, someone could say, I've heard this before. Jazz it's got an awful lot of improvisation in it. So I mean, if Beethoven improvised, Mozart improvised, Haydn improvised, all the great classical composers improvised, so were they jazz players? Well, no, they weren't jazz players. They played in their genre, whatever it was, romantic, classic, Baroque. Gosh, Bach was reportedly one of the greatest improvisers in the history of music.
Really?
But were they jazzers? No, because the element that was missing was this aspect of African American culture.
Right.
All those things that I mentioned. So you can't really call them jazzers. So at a point in the evolution of jazz, if we strip that away, all of a sudden we've got someone who, improvises quite well, but doesn't really have any experience or reference to or whatever some part of the African American culture and experience. Are they really improvising are they a jazzer anymore? And so what I'm trying to get at here is this is sort of where the music is getting to and evolving to at this point. There's stuff you would listen to and you go, wow, I'm hearing this guy from East Germany, and he's improvising, and he's getting inside of the piano, and he's putting, he's tapping on the strings, and he's, playing with sticks inside, and he's got loops going on over here, and
Right.
and that kind of stuff, and he's reportedly a jazz. This is the new thing in jazz,
Right.
and you don't hear any reference to it, So is it jazz or not? This is just entirely a conversation. It doesn't, who cares? Is it jazz or not? I mean, it's creative music, and so I guess you get my drift. That this is really what I'm saying is that a new thing? It might be just another style of improvised music. That's where this has evolved to, just something entirely different.
Right. So I mean, it sounds like it's coming full circle back to our original conversation about the different styles and which one's the best and all that stuff. In the end, it's all just creative, auditory art.
Yeah.
Or something.
And
like
I
that.
think most musicians don't care a lot about, most great musicians that I know don't care a lot about whether is it classical, is it R&B, is it jazz, what is it? It's like, if this person is creating great music, if it's obvious that this is great music and it touches you on either an emotional level or a compositional level or a performance level, or even an analytical, if there's something about that is compelling and intriguing and really draws you in some way or not, most of the great musicians I know just think that guy's really got something that he's doing there. And it could be, I just enjoy that, or it could be, wow, I wonder how I could integrate that color or that feel or that musical spice into what it is that I do.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? So like Herbie, back to Herbie, I mean, he's got so many of his last few records, all are collaborations with musicians of completely different genres than he's, I can't remember, who is it that's on? Well,
yeah, it's John Mayer.
Yeah,
and,
I mean,
some
Long, who's a classical pianist, and maybe Yo-Yo Ma, I can't remember, but there's all kind, and these musicians at these levels are collaborating with musicians who are at the same level, who have the same DNA in terms of, creativity.
Right.
It's not so important that I go get the best jazz whatever. It's like, I want to go get the best whatever.
Right.
It doesn't matter whether this person plays the tin pans or whatever. It's like that person is very highly creative and really makes thought-provoking music, and it's a new color, it's a new thing, it's their own thing, and I want to see what I sound like when I'm collaborating with that thing, so that's...
Wow. Yeah, I had honestly kind of taken that as like a publicity stunt or something like that to get your name with some like pop artists that maybe had some more money behind them. But that makes sense when you're saying it that way.
There could be some of that, and there has definitely been some of that in the past. Even with rock, right? You had the super groups, and you had someone that's making a label and making an album, and the record label will say, well, we need you to get such and such on your label because we need to try to sell more records and that kind of stuff.
Right.
But I have more and more recently, I'd say within the last 6 or 7 years, I mean, musicians truly of completely different genres.
Right.
I mean, think about it. I mean, I'll mention another one. I mean, Wynton Marsalis and Willie Nelson. I mean, some people would say, oh, that's just the craziest thing. But, if you listen to those folks talk about what it is they're doing, I mean, there's really an effort there to try to make something different. What would this sound like if we truly try to make an artistic statement and put these two things together?
Right.
Is it might not work, it might,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Cool. Well, to switch gears a little bit here, I want to do some rapid fire questions here. I want to be respectful of your time. But these are next ones are more about you and less about music in general. Omar wants to know what have your practice habits and times look like through different points in your life?
Oh yeah. Well, okay. So at the very earliest points of my life, when I started when I was 7 years old, I had an egg timer, and Mom said I had to practice the amount of money we were paying for lessons, that's how many minutes I had to practice a day.
That's awesome.
So,
I've never
so we
heard
were
of that.
paying $20 a month
Right.
for my lessons when I was very young. So I had to practice 20 minutes a day, and then it moved up to $22 a month, and then $25 a month. So eventually,
Wow.
to a certain point, I had to do the egg timer thing.
Right.
So I did that. That was through early, preteen years.
Right.
Then it didn't take. By the time I got into high school, I started being interested in. I found enough to be interested in. I was practicing on my own. I didn't have to be pushed to practice anymore.
Right. About what age?
That was in early high school,
Okay.
14, something like that.
Right.
I also did find that I really caught fire in around the 6th or 7th grade when I discovered ragtime.
Mm-hmm.
So this was an important step for me because it was something that I really liked and was willing to practice without something telling me I had to practice.
Right.
Okay. So then I found some jazz when I was in early high school, Dave Brubeck specifically. So I started listening to that, and then so then my practice started to get a little bit more. But even through high school, I wouldn't say I was ever really practicing more than say an hour or so. When I decided to become a music major in college, it improved a little bit. I was getting up to maybe a couple hours a day, just because the amount of music I had to learn forced me to get that point. When I actually transferred and became a music major in Indiana, so now I'm in my early 20s, all the kids there were just practicing all day long. So I instantly went to practicing 5 to 7 hours a day. Mostly classical music, even though my talent was more in jazz, I was doing a lot more Haydn and Beethoven, Chopin, Liszt, Schumann, Prokofiev, Bach, all this kind of stuff. I was doing a lot in my early 20s.
Right.
This went through to about my mid-20s when I finally got out of school and became a professional musician. And then my practice got a lot more towards what I might call project-oriented or goal-oriented practicing, which meant I've got to get ready for this thing that's coming up this Saturday, and so my practicing got more and more towards that. Or I've got a recording come up that I've got to get ready for. And so that's kind of the way that my practice has been over, say, the last couple of decades, which has been more maintenance,
Right.
keeping my whatever I can do on a daily basis to keep my technique together, continuing to listen and learn and practice and transcribe and things like that, and then project-oriented type of practicing.
Right.
So yeah.
Right. Cool. Mark wants to know, what's the best advice you ever received as a musician?
I guess it would be to. I just might have to say a couple things here. One would be, don't be afraid of whatever music that it is that you like. If it touches you in some way, don't in any way be afraid to learn that style of music or to study that style of music. So if someone is telling you, well, that style of music is no good, or you're going to get some bad habits, or only serious musicians do this kind of music, or whatever, I would say that's all. Yeah, it's important that in music that you like what you do. I mean, if you're considering doing this for a large portion of your life, you're going to be married to it, and so it's important that you like what it is you're married to in terms of music. Okay.
Right.
And another one is, if you're trying to develop something that's your own personal statement, that drawing on yourself as an individual and your own personal experiences and where you come from and your own personal culture. People, when they want to go hear you play, they're listening to a reflection of you. So, they want to know they're learning a little bit about you and you as an individual and as a person. So finding your own little path there and drawing on yourself as an individual, what makes you as an individual different from anybody else.
Right.
I happen to like to study all these different styles, so I like trying to play like Bud Powell or Herbie or whoever it is, McCoy Tyner and Chick Corea and all that. I enjoy that, but amongst all that, we are trying to say, yeah, but what is my thing? What's different about me?
Right.
So try to find yourself and use yourself and your own life and your own experiences and your culture and your surroundings and everything to help influence your own musical direction.
Yeah. Next one, Susan wants to know, who is your biggest in-person influence? So I guess person you've met?
Brother. My parents. Probably my parents. Beyond that, you know, my earliest my piano teachers and my serious professors. So I can mention it was a Ukrainian pianist named Yuri Olinik, my first jazz teacher whose name was Jerry Murphy, a guy named Frank Wasco, who was a classical teacher of mine, who was very influential on my technique, Karen Shaw and James Tocco at Indiana University, David Baker, who's a great jazz educator at Indiana University, and Bill Dobbins, who's a tremendous jazz pianist and scholar out of Eastman School of Music. So musically, these are the people that had the biggest influence on me personally, you know, in my early developmental years.
Right.
You know, since then I've had some musical relationships and met some people that have really kind of added just little elements of, you know, just helping to mold me a little bit, you know, that have been important to me. Some relationships I've had that have been great. But I guess that's, you know, yeah, those are some of the important ones for me.
Cool.
That come to mind right now.
Yeah, thanks. All right, just a couple more here. Will wants to know, what is the role of your instrument in the band?
Okay, well, in the piano, if I'm talking about a jazz group, you know, the piano acts as sort of a way of giving harmony and color, harmonic color, to an ensemble. So the drums would provide a lot of the, you know, rhythmic feel that you're going to get.
Right.
And the piano helps to complement that rhythmic feel by the way that I play my chords, but also adds some sort of harmonic tapestry to what's going on. Yeah. So generally what a pianist will do in a jazz group is do what's called comp. And comp either comes from accompany or a complement, whichever way you want to look at it. Most of the time, if I'm playing some swing and jazz or whatever, my role is just to do things like this. Okay, that's what I'm doing. So most of these little chords that I'm playing, if I were to take away all the chords and just played the rhythm, sound an awful lot like if I was a drummer, what the drummer might be doing with his left hand. So I'm helping to complement the rhythm, what's going on.
Right.
But then I'm also helping to harmonically support what's going on in the rhythm section, playing my chords, inverting the chords different ways, you know, trying to make it nice. So when someone's soloing, there's like some chords there going on to help to support the soloist, which would be your tenor player, your trumpet player, singer, whoever it is, to help them rhythmically, you know, kind of, you know, have some harmonic, you know, discussion going on with you. So anyway, it's crossing between the harmonic stuff and the rhythmic kind of stuff. That's what my role is generally in the band.
Yeah, cool. Last question here. Dirksen wants to know, what could people who play other instruments do to be better band members, and do you have any band-related pet peeves?
What could other... Get me that again.
Yeah.
So what could other...
I think he's trying to say, like, I'm guessing he's like he plays another instrument too, and he wants to know what do pianists hate about other instrumentalists, or what could... I've got another question here. What's the number one thing a pianist should do, should avoid doing in a gig, and a couple others that are kind of in that realm. So I guess maybe talk about, I guess, what your role isn't as a pianist, or something like that. I don't know.
Okay, so I've found a lot that piano players, you know, really, as great of an instrument as the piano is, it's one of the most, it can be one of the most dispensable instruments in a band. There's a lot of great jazz out there that is.
We'll cut that out of the post edit.
Okay, well, super important instrument. And obviously,
right.
I've spent my whole life trying to learn how to do it.
That's right.
But a lot of great jazz is out there that doesn't include piano or guitar, or a comping instrument, or a harmonic instrument. You know, it's drums, bass, and a horn player.
Right.
And so what I found that a lot of piano players do when they get in there is they're almost playing too much.
Right.
The chords are too big. They're playing too many notes. They're playing little jazzy licks behind other things. You know, what our job is to do is to add a little bit of spice, add a little bit of flavor to it. Not take everything over necessarily,
right.
But find your niche in everything that's going on to make it, to add to it. not to be it. Okay, so that's like maybe a little pet peeve about a lot of pianists. You know, it's like it all of a sudden becomes a piano concerto with accompaniment of drums and these other people. So I'm just in there, like I said, just adding a little bit of spice. One thing I think it's great for any instrument to do, if you're talking about saxophone or trumpet, is having some basic skills at some of the other instruments as well. So a saxophonist, trumpet player should learn a little bit of piano, some functional, learn your chords, learn a little bit about how to voice the chords a little bit, this will help to improve your playing. Now, in terms of what a piano player doesn't like about a horn player, remember we are accompanying you, so we're trying to help you get. If they're a soloist, I'm trying to help you through your solo. I'm trying to complement what you're doing, and maybe having a little discussion with you. You play a little thing, I play a little thing. You don't play, I fill in a little bit. You play a lot, I kind of lay back. But it is important, we have to have something to talk to you about. So if your solo doesn't have a shape to it, or if it doesn't necessarily have a story, or really isn't painting a picture, you're just sort of wiggling your fingers, around, or just making a bunch of squeaks and squawks and stuff like that, I might have a hard time figuring out what it is I'm supposed to do to contribute, to help you with your solo.
Right.
If you're just playing endless streams of eighth notes and you're never taking a break, there's really nothing for me to do. I mean, my part is essentially you're doing my part for me.
Right.
So leaving a little bit of space, trying to tell a story, try to talk in some musical sentences, play some phrases, things like that, and play with a little bit of knowledge and reference to the history a little bit. If I kind of tell where you're coming from, then that helps me to know where I should be coming from in terms of how I'm going to accompany you. So everybody should be, when you're listening to a jazz record, if you're a jazzer, don't just listen to your saxophone guy, John Coltrane or Michael Brecker or whoever it is. Listen to what everybody's doing.
Right.
The great soloists in their solo are telling the people in the rhythm section exactly how they should be playing.
Right.
A great jazz soloist in their solo informs the accompanists how they should be playing. So you're leaving space at times, and you're doing things melodically and harmonically that help us figure you out and know how to help you. So I hope that answered the question a little bit.
Yes, very good. You've been more than generous with your time. Thank you so much, Dr. Gilman, and thank you all for your questions. And we'll see you tomorrow. We're going to do the intermediate and advanced version of I Believe I Can Fly tomorrow. So join us for that. Again, Dr. Gilman, thank you so much. Until next time, everybody, good luck. Have fun.
All right.